broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, well, good day, everybody. My name is Tim Dixon. Welcome to everybody listening live to this webinar, and also welcome to those listening to it afterwards on the recording. We're very pleased today to give you a webinar on COP25, and thank you very much to Arthur Lee of Chevron for doing this and providing his unique and considered reflections on the detail that comes out of these UNFCCC COP meetings. Before we move on to Arthur, just a couple of disclaimers and announcements. Excuse me a minute. First of all, our disclaimer required by our colleagues at the International Energy Agency. We are a technology collaboration program. We were set up by the IEA, but we are autonomous from the IEA, and so the views and findings and publications and anything we express does not necessarily represent the views or policies of the IEA themselves. So we were set up by the IEA in 1991 with 36 members from 22 countries around the world, and our members set our technical program direction and detail. And we're a technically based organisation, we don't define policy. And the main things we do are produce reports, over 330 reports, on all aspects of carbon capture and storage. We run our networks of experts on all aspects of storage and also high temperature solid looping and costs. And we run the GHGT conference series and the post-combustion capture conference series. And the announcements I've got are that our GHGT 15 conference is the 5th to the 8th of October. Very pleased that we're going to be hosted by Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi. We've just had the call for abstracts close, and we're very pleased with the number of abstracts, and thank you to all of you listening who may have submitted abstracts. And the other announcement is regarding our international CCS summer schools. We have 636 alumni now, and this year the 2020 summer school is going to be in Bandung, Indonesia, hosted by ITB in July. And the announcement is that the application for students is open at the moment, and the deadline is the 31st of January. And then another announcement is that one of our research expert networks is the high temperature solid looping network. The next meeting is this month, hosted by TNO in the Netherlands, and the registration is still open for that. So you're very welcome to attend that. And of course, all of these technical reports and network meetings and knowledge generation that we do, it's very important that this knowledge is then used appropriately where it's needed. So in relation to this webinar, we are active in UNFCCC COP meetings, running the side events of the recent ones. We're active as experts in the IPCC, and we're active in the IMO, inputting technical evidence based to the London Convention meetings from our technical program. And we do all of that. Thank you very much to our members, our 36 members from all around the world. So now, with the topic of this webinar, I'd like to introduce to you Arthur Lee. I think many of you will know him already. He's got 20 years experience in energy and greenhouse gas emissions reduction. He's had a range of roles, been active quite recently in the US government's climate assessment in 2014, been active in IPCC for many years. He's currently the Chevron Fellow and Principal Advisor on Climate Change in Chevron. He's previously been with Texaco and the US EPA. He is the member representative of Chevron to IEAGHG as well, so we're very pleased to have him. And possibly most important of all, at the moment, he's in the IPCC process for the AR6 as a review editor in one of the chapters in Working Group 3, the Mitigation Working Group. So now, more of his details are provided there on the slide. Now I'd like to hand over to Arthur He's extremely well qualified to give us his considered reflections and his interpretations on COP25. And so with that, I'll hand over to you, Arthur. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim.
So just to add, we'll take questions all the way through. If people would like to type their questions in, we'll collect them, and there should be time at the end for Arthur to answer those. Sorry, thank you, Arthur. Over to you.
Oh, okay, no problem. Thank you very much, Tim, for that very kind introduction. Tim, just a quick check. You can hear me clearly?
We can.
Yes, we can.
We just need you now to I've given the screen to you, Arthur, so if you just switch to your slides.
Right. Okay, my slide, right. It's, sorry, I had them up here for, sorry about that. I had it up here for, and then it's, my screen froze. Sorry about that. Sorry, I've been having little technology issues this morning.
That's okay. We've got gale force winds blowing in the UK at the moment. But being in California, I guess you can't blame the British weather for technical issues.
We're not having sunny weather here either. It's actually raining. Okay. Okay, I have my slide up, and let me try to remember to share my screen. It's
yeah, just the one that looks like yeah. Looks like the PowerPoint screen.
Right. Sorry. I can't. Sorry about that. I'm not sure I'm seeing the button that I need to check.
Yeah, so if you go to the side panel, Arthur, and look down 1, 2, 3, 4, it should be four icons down. It looks like so going from the top. So you've got the mute button and a video, and then the one below that. So if you can go to that one.
Right. It's just view in full screen mode.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's me right now. Sorry, I'm only seeing still my own bio. How do I actually share it? Sorry.
Just click on that button.
If you move your cursor down slightly, right. That's just there.
This one. Can you see where I've put that now?
I'm afraid not. I see your cursor, but I don't see. Can you put up the slide deck that I sent to you?
We can put the slides up then, and you can just ask us to progress them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be best. Sorry about that. I seem to be missing a button here.
Just.
So we did have a rehearsal and everything worked fine, but something's changed.
We've got some technical issues today.
Since
yeah, I have some screen problems. I don't know what's missing.
Okay, so
I just want full screen for this. Is that this one?
It's the one I sent to you very recently.
Yeah, we've got it here. We're just trying to open it into view.
Can you see it on your screen, Arthur?
No, not yet. Sorry.
So you can't see that, Arthur? Okay.
No, I cannot see. I saw your slides earlier, but not seeing anything now. My apologies, everyone. It's not. I'm not sure why my computer is not Okay. Yes, I see it.
Just come up.
Okay.
Very good. I see the slide deck now.
It was
Yes,
taking a little while to load, Arthur. So.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Here's the title slide. Right. Okay. So sorry about that. Again, apologies. And as Tim had mentioned, I have observed these COP meetings for quite a long time. I think this was quite likely my 20th, if not my 21st COP. I might have missed one in the middle. I think Marrakesh COP7, I believe it was probably one of the ones I missed. But I did, of course, make it to the COP22 Marrakesh afterwards. But anyway, at this point, let me just say that in some ways, this COP has been a very successful COP. I'll put it in the kind of in that context. I know it sounds kind of strange coming from me, but in some ways, it's very successful. And I'll explain very quickly why. Because I think this COP, although it was canceled by the Chilean presidency to be held in Santiago because of its own country's unrest and actually violence as well. The country of Spain, the government of Spain, immediately actually stepped up, perhaps even without any coordination from the announcement by the Chilean government. The very next day, actually proposed that it host the COP at the same time period, and within within less than 3 weeks' time, we're able to mobilize enough resources and actually people to get it done and host it at Madrid. COP25 was actually Madrid at an existing conference center that was very large and certainly suitable for very large trade shows and various other large events that can fit over 25,000 people. In fact, the whole venue, not the entire venue, the entire venue was not actually completely used. There were at least 3 other plenary halls that were left not used in this venue. So it was very successful in that sense that the Spanish government was able to get everything together and supported the Chilean presidency, which still held that presidency. And what that means is I know some of you on the webinars here are familiar, and some of you may not be. When you are president or presiding over the COP, your job as a country actually becomes that of a facilitator and more of a mediator between countries and on issues, especially during the second week of the COP. So you take on that role, and your negotiators, who used to be your negotiators, or your diplomats or diplomatic corps of folks, you now have the role of facilitating the negotiation rather than participant as one of the ones with interest in the negotiations. So the Chilean presidency was supported by the Spanish government in all respects, as I understand it, and we're able to hold this COP in many ways successfully and procedurally. So I think both the Spanish government and Chilean government ought to be and should and were congratulated with a great deal of gratitude from other countries. Now, having said all that, of course, as I subtitled the talk here, it's Cooperative Approaches, Divided Nations. And that comes from the fact that even though there were decisions made and there were agreements on some issues, one of the key set of issues called the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the Cooperative Approaches in the Paris Agreement, actually did not get agreed to. In fact, it was at COP24 that countries, also in the first time, did not agree to that, while the rest of the Paris Agreement received, I think, mostly successful conclusion to the implementation details. But the Cooperative Approaches Article 6 did not, and continue to be divisive and was not
Okay. Can we hear us?
There's Suzanne.
Hi.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, somehow you were cut out. Could you just advance to the next slide? Thank
Yes,
you.
absolutely.
Okay, I guess we're just not very lucky this morning.
I'm wondering if it's weather conditions that might, I don't know, if that has anything to do with it. What we are experiencing extremely horrendous weather conditions at the moment.
Yeah, it's quite possible. Okay, so it's really in the longest this COP25 again in terms of process. I won't make this belabor this point too much. It's really the longest in the history of the UN climate change negotiations. Durban, or COP, I think it was COP17 in Durban was the longest. It lasted until Sunday morning around I think closed around 6 a.m. when the chair then the president then gavelled it to close at 6 a.m. This one, COP25 Madrid or Chile, was actually ended at approximately 1 p.m. Okay. Now I will concede to the fact I was actually not there. I was not a diehard observer. I was already back in the United States where I'm based, and in California, in fact. And so I just followed it by webcast. And also I'd follow some of my colleagues who are much more persistent and are diehards as well. And I believe Tim also has told me that he stayed until Saturday as well. So anyway, so approximately 1 p.m. it closed. So it was the longest COP in the history of the UN negotiations. And as I said, there were decisions that were made, but the ones that were not made that were continue to be quite controversial. In addition to Article 6 was what's called the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, and also the long-term climate finance decisions. The loss and damage decision has a lot to do with in the history of these negotiations since COP19 Warsaw, it was COP19 in Warsaw, that the countries agreed to setting out something called the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, and it has to do with setting out issues on loss and damage, and whether, at the original time of the negotiation, whether there would be liability on countries for payment on any kind of damages that another country could claim against those countries that could be emitting large amounts of emissions. So that's that was the origination of that mechanism. As the negotiations evolved, the loss and damage mechanism is now much more about early warning systems, about surveillance of the climate, and about more about resilience and not necessarily about adaptation, but more about resilience. And again, like I said, early warning systems and mechanisms to address any kind of international aid to countries that might suffer climate-related disasters. So that there was a series of issues being negotiated at this COP that would continue to grow that mechanism. But however, those decisions were not made at COP25. Long-term climate finance has to do with the issues, again, long-standing issues since I think it was COP21 certainly, when there was commitment by countries to mobilize by this year, by 2020, $100 billion, $100 billion of climate finance to mobilize that. This year at the COP25, there should have been some statement made to emphasize that, to emphasize the continuation of that. But again, countries could not agree to such a statement, and so that decision was deferred to COP26. Okay, so these two major issues also did not receive any kind of agreement, and countries were thus silent on this. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm pressing my keyboard here. Okay. Right. So, I think I said a lot of this already, and I think much of I would say that. I would say that in the last point I would like to make here that that because there was no commitment by countries to continue this. Now, it does not mean that the commitment has died. It simply means that this year there was countries decided not to emphasize on this because there was no agreement to emphasize this mobilization. But the commitment, as far as I understand it, is still there, and countries will continue talking about it in the COP26 about mobilizing $100 billion next year. Now, several developing countries did express very strong disappointments, and in some ways, you can view their statements as not only disappointments, but also as a way of warning that that many of their nationally determined contributions will not be achievable without this long-term financing that was promised to them. Okay, so that's I'll just use that. I'll leave it there. They made very strong statements that the NDCs would not be achieved. Okay, so next slide, please. Now, some of you who do follow this more closely would have remembered that at COP24 in Katowice, there were actually significant disagreements about whether to even welcome the science that was done, that was released in October of 2018 by the IPCC on the special report on the 1.5 to 2 degree temperature rise, that special report on 1.5 or 2 degrees, and that eventually the COP24 statement was to simply note the on-time delivery of the science and so on, but not really welcomed the science. Finally, I think at COP25, countries, I think, moved past that and onto other issues as they obviously they had the Article 6 issues much more central to the negotiations. But at COP25, they were able to at least make this statement now that underlines the essential contribution reflects the best available science and encourages parties to continue to support the work of the IPCC. So they did finally, I think, express that appreciation, even though they still did not. I think the strongest phrase that they could have used in these recitation decisions would have been to welcome, but they actually did say it in, I guess, the next best way is to express its appreciation and gratitude. So that's a statement that was made finally to address what was left as something that was a big disagreement back in COP24. And also, I would note this too, that underlines the essential contribution of nature to addressing climate change and its impacts and the need to address biodiversity loss and climate change in an integrated manner. Now, the Biodiversity Convention is also up for negotiations again, I think soon. I don't follow that, sorry, but those of you who might follow that would know that there is that this statement links to that Biodiversity Convention, certainly, and certainly also give recognition that nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions is also now very much a part of the landscape and has to be considered in our approach to climate change. Okay, next slide, please. Another theme at the COP was every president of a COP can choose to emphasize certain aspects of the negotiations and also maybe feature some dialogue and roundtable discussion between ministers, between the high level, the leads of each of the national delegations. So the president, Carolina Schmidt of Chile, the environment minister, decided this year that she would emphasize the ocean. The ocean is part of the Earth biosphere and emphasize the importance and criticality of the ocean. So the theme of this is called the Blue COP. And there was actually at least one round of conversations about ocean, and of course there's ocean, land, enhanced adaptation actions as well. But this year's theme was indeed about ocean. Now, other issues also got agreed to about gender, and citing as one of the decisions that the latter, gender, as climate change impacts the most on women in the world. And I would think that and for many of us who are in the private sector and more in the business community, there's also the acknowledge the important role of those of us who are NGOs, non-government organizations. And of course, in this kind of language, what that means is the United Nations actually does recognize people in the business industry, NGO, gender, the NGOs, the youth movement or youth NGO, trade unions and labor, which of course back in COP24, the Polish government, being the president then, emphasized what's called the issue of just transition, and that issue continues to receive airing and conversations at COP25 about how measures and responses to respond to climate change policies that would could displace labor and certain groups of workers who have to be retrained in the new economy and in the new forms of energy and energy resources. So trade unions were also quite influential in these discussions, and the indigenous peoples NGO as well. Now, there was actually, at the very last minute, I noted this in the plenary, the final plenary of the COP, that paragraph 30 and 31 actually received almost a half hour of debate and back and forth negotiation between Brazil and several countries. And this paragraphs 30 and 31 has a lot to do with, again, with the ocean, and again with the climate change and ocean and nature. And Brazil objected to their inclusions. Brazil wanted these two paragraphs 30 and 31 struck out. But after a long list of parties spoke up against Brazil, Brazil decided and retracted its proposal. Now, I point this out to you not necessarily single out Brazil, but just to I think let you know the process is really fraught. In these negotiations. Again, those of you who follow these would know what I'm going to say next. But these negotiations actually are governed by a set of draft rules. They're not really governed by anything that are final rules. In 1996, when I think the first COP was convened, there was a set of proposal for rules of how these negotiations would be carried out and how countries could make agreements on every issue. But the draft rules were actually never agreed to, and it was actually due to one provision in the rules have to do with agreement itself, whether voting or not voting or by consensus, and therefore the countries then, in some ways, in an unwritten way, agreed to continue to use the draft rules by default, even though these rules have never been finalized. And so, therefore, at any of these plenaries, between nations, between the COP countries, the COP parties, anyone can object to anything in the proceedings, and could just by continuous objection to block any progress. So that has happened many times in these COP before, and it is always necessary to somehow form contact groups to make sure then consensus is reached. And as you can see, sometimes consensus is not reached. Okay, next slide, please. Right, I explained this already. I think the long-term finance was not addressed at COP25, even though, yes, it received actually 2 weeks of negotiation, it was not agreed to. And so there was no statement at all about the mobilizing the $100 billion climate finance. And many countries, as I said, were very disappointed and made very strong statements. Okay, and I think at the end, it was the like-minded developing countries, or the LMDCs, such as Malaysia representing them, made very strong statements that their nationally determined contribution might not be achievable without long-term finance. Now, as I said before, these draft rules are still draft even ever since 1996, and so there was this draft rule 16, which when it's invoked, it means that all papers, all kinds of issues that were agreed to leading up to a draft negotiating text, all of that would have to be redone and renegotiated. So they would go back to square one and talk about this decision again in COP26. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I talked a little bit about this already, so let me just move on. Next slide, please. Right. So I think the main event, as I like to call it, the main event between countries, they themselves know it was, is Article 6, because that was completely left unagreed to. There was really no agreement on Article 6 at COP24. And then at COP25, I must say, they made every attempt to come to an agreement with different modes of working, with facilitators from in the second week from the Spanish government and as well from the Chilean presidency to try to bridge the gap on all the issues of Article 6. Now, the key issues that at the very last minute, literally at the very last minute, I think on Saturday morning, still everything fell apart. Early in the morning of Saturday, I think, perhaps late night, I would say, everything fell apart over really two issues. I mean, there could be a couple more, but I think these are the most significant. From what I understand, the share proceeds, also now known as adaptation financing, okay, it's been something that has divided countries since they started these talks about Article 6 at COP22. Okay, this is of course the COP after the Paris Agreement. So, and how to shape these share proceeds? What that means is you take 2%, 2% from the from any kind of trades, emission trade that you make between countries. You take 2% of those proceeds. It's kind of like a tax. You take 2% of that and put that into the adaptation fund, which is an instrument of policy that was created during the Kyoto Protocol. Okay, so this was not agreed to. Okay, and then there was also another issue that, again, it's also a holdover issue from the Kyoto Protocol. It's these units, emission units or credits that were created in the Clean Development Mechanism, which itself is Article 12 of the Kyoto Protocol. Okay, the Clean Development Mechanism, if you have created credits, how do you treat those? Whether you can still use them post 2020 under the Paris Agreement, governance of the Paris Agreement. So the issue of the treatment of these credits, not only the credits, but the projects themselves that may still be ongoing. And there are some projects that, of course, like forestry projects, could be afforestation or prevention of deforestation kind of projects, for example, could still be ongoing for decades. And those kind of projects, how do you treat them? Whether they would continue under the Paris Agreement governance under Article 6. So that's kind of transfer issues of both the emission units as well as the projects themselves. The project activities were subject of intense negotiations. And when you look at the text, the various iterations of text, in my personal opinion, I could see that they were getting closer and closer. And the window of time that they decided on having a transition period became part of the options on the table. And so there was this transition period proposed to allow these credits to be used and allow the projects to continue with certain criteria. But at the end, everything still fell apart at the early morning hours of Saturday. And I think Japan, I just have pictures here that I took from the plenary webcast. The negotiators from Japan, the EU, commented that they will still insist on no pre-2020 units to be transferred to the Paris Agreement. Now, in any negotiations, I think the dynamics that perhaps many of you have seen and observed for yourself in negotiation, after everything falls apart, the parties tend to retreat back to their corners and reiterate, tend to restate their original positions. And in many ways, that's what countries are now doing again. They have retreated back to their corners and have restated their very hardline positions. And that I think is what's happening. Now, okay, and I stated the last point here is on the other side of the EU and Japan, for example, is Brazil. It's the leading proponent of transferring CDM credits with no restrictions. Okay, so next slide, please. think I'm almost done with this. Next slide. Okay. Well, anyway, there's just more details here. Sorry. I think one of the details in the previous slide, has to do with the Article 6.4, which would have set up a sustainable development mechanism in a sense. I know I'm kind of a little bit loose and fast with my terminology. It's a mechanism that kind of like the CDM, Clean Development Mechanism, in many ways, and is a mechanism for allowing countries to cooperate as well as support sustainable development. That's the actual language. And so many of us, people like me, give it a shorthand calling it the Sustainable Development Mechanism. And so there's also the issue in Article 6 in Article 6 itself, that there is that countries need to also contribute to an overall mitigation of emissions. The OMGE issue, overall mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, got shorthand in the negotiations as the OMGE issue, and that they need to shave off 2% in addition to 2% for adaptation. So in many ways, if a market does shape up under rules such as these, there would at least be 2% taken out from for adaptation funds, and then a maximum of another 2% to be shaved off, a haircut, if you will, to go into to be retired. Actually, excuse me. What I mean to say is the other 2% would be a retirement of those credits. That way, it would help to achieve an overall mitigation, a reduction of emissions, rather than keeping emissions flat. So, next slide, please. Right, and this is just the more details. When you read the last version of the text, they were really close, in that the transition period was of a certain time period, really about I think 2 years or so. If you read the details, really given the timing of if there were agreements, it would have been roughly around 2 years to agree to 2 to 3 years of a transition period. Okay, next slide, please. I think I'm almost there to the end. Technology mechanism was agreed to. In previous years, the technology negotiations had some controversy as well. This is part of what's called the technology mechanism of the UN Framework Convention. And this has to do with technology transfer, technology development and transfer between countries, mainly about, of course, about transfer of technologies from the developed world to the developing nations. And this, at this COP, there was some disagreement, even a report that's an annual report from one of the constituted bodies called the well, actually two of the constituted bodies called the Technology Executive Committee and also the Climate Technology Center and Network. A joint annual report from those two entities you would normally think it's not that controversial. It's simply stating what it has done, what it has achieved with the budget it has. But every time at these COPs, every time when these joint annual reports are negotiated, countries tend to load up the negotiations with their discontent, if you will, and dissatisfaction with various other issues that may be outside of the technology mechanism. And the funding issue is always one of those issues. And it's the phrase here is called enhanced support. And that issue is always front and center in these negotiations, even though it's only about the performance of these two bodies in a joint annual report. So countries always haggle over enhanced support as one of the key issues. And the phrasing, enhanced support, finally was struck out from the negotiations. at 10:30 Saturday, first Saturday. For that one, I stayed towards almost until the end, just observing these countries towards the very end, really going over lines and statements of these issues over and over again, and also then coming up with some creative solutions in the wording. And so instead of enhanced support, the final agreed wording was make available sufficient resources. Okay, so enhanced support went away, and then is make available sufficient resources became the words that used in the final agreement. And the private sector was initially de-emphasized in the language, but at the end, countries compromised and agreed to having the private sector mentioned once in the agreement. So, okay, next slide, please. Okay, Tim, I turn it over to Tim Dixon, who will talk about CCS side events.
Okay, thank you very much, Arthur. So just briefly on this, so the UNFCCC has its series of side events at COPs intended to provide up-to-date and the latest science and technical developments into the negotiations. And we've been fortunate in getting one of these. They were applied for by many, for a limited number of them. And we had one this time with our lead collaborators being the University of Texas, BEG, was a formal official lead, and with our partners, also International CCS Knowledge Center, Bologna, and the CCSA. And we made it focused upon where the original COP was meant to be, on the interests of Chile and South America, as you can see from the title. Carbon removal and return, can CCS decarbonize industry in South America and help the oceans, knowing that it is intended to be a blue COP, as Arthur described. And there you can see the IISD's official coverage from photos, etc. And the content that we provided is summarized there on the left, basically highlighting the IPCC special report on oceans and cryosphere, the need for CO2 reduction from the atmosphere to reduce ocean acidification. And that's the need for why we need to do CCS. And direct air capture needs the S bit of CCS still. And then we had from Carol Turley from PML, we had Joan Wilcox describing the capture from the atmosphere of CO2. Then we had Catherine Romanak from BEG at the University of Texas talking about how we put it beneath the ground, out of the atmosphere, storing it safely, monitoring it, etc. And then, because developing countries are very much the target audience for us, we had the example of Trinidad and Tobago in developing their own national program to develop CCS in their country. And very importantly, CO2 from industrial sources, a presentation on CCS to decarbonize cement production with a new agreement from the International CCS Knowledge Center on their collaboration in Alberta. And then a new aspect, because there's growing interest in the socio-economic aspects of mitigation options, and Piero Patrizio from IASA presented on sustainable jobs from BECS in South America, quantifying the benefits of job creation through CCS, and particular bioenergy with CCS, and concluding with Bologna on CO2 transport and storage, providing a flexible low carbon infrastructure, particularly for CO2 industrial clusters. So that was our side event, and back over to you, Arthur, for coverage of other events outside of the main negotiations.
Sure, thank you, Tim. And I'll just really conclude with maybe just one, maybe a couple of more slides, and that's it for Q&A. This is, as I said, the longest COP, but also this was probably the most protested COP in my memory, maybe even in the recent memory. There was this particular event, I mean, with the rise of perhaps with the youth movement, as we all know and have seen, led by, characterized by Ms. Greta Thunberg. I think the youth movement has gained a lot of strength and momentum during UN Climate Week back in September in New York, but also at this meeting, I think there were many of them, and they actually must have planned this protest well in advance at some point, I guess, and really disrupted the proceedings on the Wednesday of the COP. It was unfortunate, and it was unsanctioned because, as those of you who follow the COP and are actually have been to the negotiating venue, you know that any of the NGOs can actually stage an event, even of course side events, of course, as Tim mentioned, but also there are various places where they can announce to the UN police, the UN security staff, to say that they will protest, and normally they're allowed to do this. I have not heard of protests that have been not accepted, especially if they are in areas where the UN police can certainly provide safety and security. But this was unannounced, completely a surprise to the organizers, and disrupted one of the sessions on, I think, pre-2020 commitments. And so it took a long time to clear the stage, a long time to clear the room, and hundreds of many of the NGOs were debadged and expelled from the site. I understand later, a day later, they were allowed back in, but this could have been cause for not only expelling those individuals, but also expelling those organizations under which they had registered. So this was the largest protest I have ever seen, and the most disruptive, unscheduled that I have experienced. So it's over the years I have seen more and more of these, and I think, but this has become highly disruptive, and I do hope it's not continues as a trend, but it is something that I think we are all observing, not only in the UN venue, of course, but outside in the world at large. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, just additional photos. This is Jim Skay, one of the co-chairs of the Working Group 3, IPCC. He was there to talk to us about the 6th assessment report. As Tim mentioned, I will be one of the review editors, in fact, of the energy systems chapter to help the process, to help the IPCC process. So next slide, please. Maybe I'll just close up with one more. Let me point out that one of the issues I do follow very closely is actually climate technology transfer and deployment. So I have participated in at least 2-3 years of the technology mechanism negotiations directly as well, and I think the development of those of the mechanism is going well enough under the constraints that it has. It has a certain very limited budget. This might come as a surprise to many of you, maybe not, I don't know. But when it first started, the commitment was that countries donated to the UN technology mechanism was roughly $5 million to the Climate Technology Center and Network. And so a lot of these grants that are given by the Climate Technology Center and Network are roughly in the form of, say, $50,000 to $200,000 each to a country to conduct technology needs assessment, which basically is a study of what the country needs and what kind of resources it might have, and the kind of resources that others can bring to that country. So with a range of $50,000 to $250,000, a country, a nation, a government is supposed to, with a consultant's help or a company's help that do this kind of work, to set out its technology needs. But then the actual development and scaling up of technology actions would have to rely on others to come behind that technology needs assessment to actually scale up any kind of development and investments that that country needs. So in many ways, even though in my view, the CTCN and of course the Technology Executive Committee I think they're trying to do their jobs, but it is really, to scale up technology, it hasn't done that. So I'll be very kind in saying that it just has not done that. The scope and the scale of what it does, what it was intended to do, it's certainly doing that, but it's not doing enough to really scale up anything. Now, the three most powerful people, I think most influential people currently in the technology mechanism are the three people you see in the center. I think I named them here. Orly Jacob of Canada, she's right there in the center, chair of the advisory board of the CTCN. And then you have Dinara Gershenkova, who's chair of the Technology Executive Committee. And then you have Rose Webaza, who's the director. So she's really the executive director of the staff of the CTCN. Okay, so they're the three most influential, most powerful people in technology transfer at the UN level today. Okay, I think I'll just close there, and I'll close there for questions. Thank you, Tim. I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Arthur. And a nice point to end on there, Arthur, with the gender balance there on the technology mechanism. And that was one of the things we were proud of with our side event as well, is that we had very good gender balance. 5 out of 8 of the presenters were female, and that wasn't by design. That just reflects the world we work in. And I should also mention that Arthur did organise a side event for IEAGHG as well that highlighted the CCP project's work on review of CCS regulations. I think, Arthur, you had this in a later slide, but given the time pressures, but that was a good event, and for sharing sort of best practice in CCS regulation and bringing it very much up to date with the developments in the US with 45Q and with the London Protocol as well. So with that, we don't have many questions, Arthur, but I have a question for you, and that is, what are your thoughts on the prospects for COP26?
Right. Well, I think for COP26, I'm always an optimist. I think the countries will, I would hope will see some sense and their own self-interest at play, that cooperation will be better than having no cooperation, no cooperative mechanisms. And these cooperative mechanisms for many of us in the business community would mean emission trading or any kind of harmonized carbon pricing mechanisms between countries to help from one country helping another to achieve its emission reduction goals. So that to me, I'm always hopeful. Now, that does not mean that that will actually happen, as I was hopeful this time around after the failure of COP24, and it was so close. I have to say it was really close. Looking at the draft language for negotiation, it was very close, and it just fell apart at the last minute, basically at 1 a.m. in the morning Saturday. So we'll see. I think COP26 at Glasgow is supposed to be, because it's the year 2020, is supposed to be the year when countries are supposed to revise, start sending in their revised nationally determined contributions. Okay, now they're not required to increase or enhance the level of action, okay, but they are certainly strongly encouraged those countries that are willing to do so to do that. So 2020 will be an important year. I know I say this every year is important, but as we progress along on this journey, COP COP26 is an important year in that respect, that countries are supposed to revise and enhance their level of ambition, their actions, and we'll see whether that will actually come to fruition at Glasgow. So that's all I have on my crystal ball, which is, like everyone else's, is quite obscured and foggy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Arthur, for that. I'm just going to take the chair's prerogative to progress 2 slides, if that's okay with you, Arthur, just to showcase Arthur's hard work at these COPs. He moderated this IPECA event, focusing on technology and natural solutions, and organised this event, which was the one on CCS regulation. Arthur is a very busy person at these COPs, and I apologise to all of the listeners for the technical glitches at the beginning, but there will be a recording of this available afterwards as well that will go out, and we will make the slides available. And so I'd like to end by thanking you, Arthur, very much for putting this presentation together and presenting it with your years of experience and background knowledge. You do provide a unique perspective on what are complex negotiations. And, if you weren't there, Arthur, receiving the draft texts, then we would not know, or the audience would not know, what was nearly negotiated and agreed in Article 6, for example, and how close we were, and some of the important points that are within that. So we very much appreciate you being there, Arthur, and providing this webinar for us as well. And there's a briefer summary that I've put onto the IEAGHG website as a blog afterwards. But with that, I'll draw this to a close and say thank you very much, Arthur Lee, and thank you very much to our audience for listening.
All right, thank you all, and thank you, Tim. Thank you, and your work in CCS as well. Your photos right there on the slide. So, thank you, Tim.
Yeah, that wasn't why I put this up.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye. Jim, Suzanne.
I'll just